Welcome to this roundtable at the International Congress of Culture in Climate Action. We are welcoming our speakers from this roundtable, Chris Wiebe and William Megarry. Welcome to the Congress. We are going to present each other, and then you could share your screens with your presentations. Chris Wiebe is the manager, Heritage Policy and Public Programs at the National Trust for Canada. He is also the Vice Chair for North America in Climate Heritage Network. Welcome, Chris.
Great, thank you so much. Great to be here. I'll just share my screen. Are you seeing the screen now?
Not yet.
Interesting. Okay. Is that better?
Yes, perfect.
Excellent. You seeing my messy desk? Not so good. Okay, so thanks so much, everyone. I'm Chris Wiebe. I'm the manager of Heritage Policy and Government Relations at the National Trust for Canada in Ottawa. Really, thank you so much for this opportunity. Exciting to be a part of this international conversation. I'm looking forward to the conversation here today. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining you today from the traditional unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people here in the Ottawa area. They have been stewards of this land and waters since time immemorial, and we're grateful for that. So the National Trust for Canada, just very briefly, was created in 1973. And it's the leading national charity dedicated to the conservation of Canada's heritage places. But we have other partners, and there's a number that I wanted to spotlight today, including the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals, frequent collaborators. They're kind of the professional organization, coast to coast. Also, the Indigenous Heritage Circle, created about around 10 years ago, and is dedicated to the advancement of cultural heritage priorities for Métis, Inuit, and First Nations people in Canada. And of course, other frequent collaborators are the CHN, the Climate Heritage Network, and ICOMOS Canada. So today, I just want to look at some of the recent initiatives, Canadian initiatives that have been bringing together heritage and climate action in the country, and wanting to look at that. So just to back up a little bit, I mean, I think the whole kind of conversation in Canada, at least, around the connection between built and natural heritage has been going on for quite a while. The National Trust put out a report, the one on the left, in 2001, and it was kind of a path-breaking study. I mean, I think there were like a lot of discussions in the US, et cetera, around the oil crisis in the 70s, looking at the intersection of the environmental with heritage places and existing buildings, etc. But it's interesting because it didn't actually sort of take off in terms of some of the larger conversations. Although over the course of the 2000s, that whole kind of idea around embodied carbon, around avoided carbon, really started gaining momentum. But it's interesting to see how it has or hasn't kind of had an impact on public policy. So a second report, just sort of trying to give you kind of some of the background in terms of, at least from the National Trust perspective, some of the work that we've been doing. There was a report looking at financial measures to encourage heritage development. And that was really interesting because it was insightful, because it was looking at why isn't building reuse, which is sort of the larger kind of context for heritage conservation work, the kind of the larger cultural framework, why isn't heritage conservation sort of the new normal? Or why isn't that really sort of be as easy as we think it is? We had a chance to talk to over 30 property developers around the country, and we started hearing about some of the barriers and opportunities there available to them, and why they were sort of making their way to in the new construction rather than reuse direction. So that led to a third final report in about 2020, looking at this idea of making reuse the new normal and how to actually operationalize some of these things. And in it, we unpacked in greater depth some of the challenges. So really quickly, just looking at that, and this is in collaboration with some of our friends at Carleton University, who created this great diagram. Really, we identified various barriers to reuse. That was the economic side of things, and some of the challenges there, as you can see up at the top. It's kind of a busy diagram. Is there are lack of funding, but I think one of the biggest economic, at least in the Canadian context and in urban areas, is the return on investment and the rising cost of land, which does not make the retention of older buildings frequently smaller than could be that is zoned for those sites, makes them kind of unaffordable or unattractive. So there needs to be more thinking around how to intensify in a good way with retaining and also providing more space for housing and other needs in growing communities, and also to fill that funding gap. Also, maybe we're seeing this in other parts of the world too, but a physical technical challenges around the risk of the unknown, and that in terms of the building technologies employed, and also some of that leads to questions of education. A lot of people coming out of professional schools and trade schools don't have experience in older buildings, and it's kind of ironic because I think we've seen in the U.S. that 35 or 55 rather percent of their work of architects there in some of their latest stats is on existing buildings, and yet architecture schools in Canada and the U.S., well, at least in Canada, don't actually require students to come out of school with any kind of knowledge in that regard. It's all focused on new design. So there's a huge kind of like intellectual gap that's hobbling things. Same with the trades sphere as well, where it's repair and rehab isn't emphasized as much as new construction. There's also the kind of the challenge there around not embodied carbon requirements. In Canada, you can get a demolition permit without having to justify, or even having to calculate the carbon that will be discarded in the building materials that are being thrown away, and the carbon footprint, the life cycle footprint of the new building going up. So there's some big gaps there. Also on the regulatory side, I would say that the demolition policies, you can see right in the center there, are very easy to obtain. And there's some challenges around tax policy in terms of rapidly depreciating buildings and also disadvantaging older places. But I think one of the really interesting parts is sort of in that kind of left side, cultural. And it's a big fuzzy problem. And there really is a new construction bias. And in terms of talking to developers, we've heard, developers just do what they do, and they have a certain model which involves clearing the site and putting up new buildings. So I think, and that's easier for them in terms of putting up their pro formas for their construction projects, etc., and getting funds from banks. So I think there's this whole idea of the linear economy, at least in the Canadian context, this kind of linear economy, this throwaway culture is deeply ingrained, and I think it may be you could explore it. It's probably rooted in some of the the abundance of land and also resources that Canada has been blessed with, has led to a laziness and sort of a decadence in terms of the use of its materials. Actually, Canada is the second largest producer per capita of garbage in the world, and it's a terrible thing. So Canada really needs to work on that quite a bit more. So what has been happening in the heritage realm, and I think I have about a few more minutes left, right, Mauro? 3 minutes? Okay, I'll keep it going here. So what are we doing to try to counteract this? Well, there's a really interesting project that is going on, Canada-wide research project happening at the architectural faculties across Canada. It's really the most interesting part for us is this adaptive reuse group that is a subset within it. I think it's kind of hijacked and like informed the conversation in a really interesting direction. The whole kind of research project was oriented around how to create new high quality architecture. But this group has really been led by people at Carleton University, etc., in Ottawa, have really been trying to push this idea of adaptive reuse first, and pushing it into that kind of mainstream conversation. So I think I think it's giving it legs, and I think there's some exciting things coming out of that. The another group is the Canadian Association of Heritage Professionals. Again, this other group that we work with. They've had some really great workrooms looking at climate action and adaptive reuse, really looking at building and typologies and trying to advance them in understanding in terms of which kind of buildings work best for reuse. There was a very interesting the latest our Association for Preservation Technology conference in Montreal, which we collaborated with CAP and Indigenous Heritage Circle and ICOMOS Canada on. There was a really exciting workroom where they're trying to attack some of these problems, really sort of resolve some, and figure out opportunities for advocacy at the professional level with professional associations, but also at the governmental level. The other exciting thing, and it's a bit of a another problem that the part of it in terms of adaptation as opposed to mitigation in terms of the climate impacts, is this whole challenge around Indigenous cultural heritage. And there was a really informative and illuminating presentation in Montreal just recently at our conference with APT from the groups like the Anishinaabe Ojibwakan. And here you see, the center of Ottawa, where it was a place where for thousands of years Indigenous peoples gathered in the Ottawa area, and there's significant archaeological resources there. Some of the challenges there is that with rising water levels, rising flood levels, thousands of years of archaeological history and cultural material is being washed away every year in this area. So basically, there's young people in this Anishinaabe Ojibwakan group. It's a archaeological training school with populated with Indigenous young people. They are rapidly doing research or rescue archaeology to try to capture as much as they can of this disappearing history that helps tell the story of their connection to this place over almost 10,000 years. So there's the whole side of thing. I think the other conversation that's happening with Indigenous groups too is the idea of unchecked primary resource extraction and its impact on Indigenous territories and lands. That hasn't really been so much a part of the conversation in terms of the kind of climate justice or the social justice kind of dimension of things. So we're working in that direction as well. So just really quickly here, just last slide. What are some of the initiatives that the National Trust and others have been doing? I think there's been a marked shift, I would say, in the last 5 years in terms of that kind of a lack of knowledge around the connection between the environmental and carbon impacts with heritage conservation reuse. I think it's actually kind of going mainstream in the media. We're seeing more and more, at least in our media kind of monitoring, picking up on more things, people talking about deconstruction, and I'm hoping Jenny Hay can join us today to talk a bit more about some of the work there. I guess Shannon Miller talked on Wednesday about that, and from San Antonio. But I'm seeing a marked shift in terms of the conversation becoming more mainstream around the carbon footprint and retaining embodied carbon and the avoided carbon of not creating new buildings entering the mainstream. We've also tried to highlight it in our endangered places list, and on the right there was a climate edition a couple of years ago that really pointed to some rather kind of ordinary buildings that were in danger of being demolished. Including the one in the bottom left side there, which was the largest hotel in Canada with 1,200 rooms, and it was going to be demolished for an even bigger building. That's since been put on hold, but it was just a great example of a place that didn't need to justify why it was being demolished and the environmental impact of all that incredible amount of concrete, reinforced concrete building going into landfill or rubble in some form. The other thing that we're doing is really trying to make the case with our partners at ICOMOS and Indigenous Heritage Circle and CAP, with the federal environment minister, really connecting the dots for him and for them, but in the connection between older places and environmental climate action. And we're seeing that with some of our other partners at the provincial level in Canada, the lower level of government, or who are also making the case with their particular governments. So maybe I'll just leave it there, just sort of like quick kind of like scamper through the various kind of initiatives and some of the discussions that have been happening with Canada. We can unpack a few more of them later if we have time. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. We will have a Q&A moment at the end of this roundtable. So we invite the participants to send their questions through the chat. We are presenting now the next speaker. William Megarry is Reader in Archaeology at Queen's University Belfast and focal point for climate change to ICOMOS. Welcome, William.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mauro, and congratulations on this wonderful event. It's so amazing to have these kind of events running, just to raise awareness and to meet together, I think, and work together on what is such an important issue. And thank you, Chris, as well, for your preceding presentation. Building retrofit and reuse seems to be the hidden secret in so much when it comes to climate action. I come from a country where we've had two budgets recently. Both have committed to carbon neutrality, and neither have dealt with the issue of building retrofit, which is insane given our historic building stock in this part of the world. Anyway, hopefully lots of time to discuss this together later on in this session. My name is Will Megarry. I am just still the focal point for climate at ICOMOS, but I think this will probably be my last presentation as focal point before I hand over to my colleague Eve Paulus from ICOMOS Estonia, who will be taking over the position for the next 3 to 4 years. And so what I'd like to talk about today are the actions we have been taking within ICOMOS and specifically within our Climate Action Working Group to prepare the heritage sector for climate action. Essentially, the focus of my talk today is going to be about climate literacy in heritage. I'm going to talk about our need for new tools and methodologies in the heritage sector to respond to climate change, and also the need to democratize climate action globally. And the impetus for this theme comes from numerous studies and reports and initiatives by both ourselves in ICOMOS, but also by colleagues at other advisory bodies, other heritage organizations, and at UNESCO, which have repeatedly identified a lack of knowledge within the heritage sector on how we respond to the increasing threats from climate change. This was a theme that came up in our own report, The Futures of Our Pasts. It was a theme that came up from surveys undertaken of our 12,000 global members. It was a theme that came up during the drafting of the updated policy document on climate action for World Heritage, which was ratified last year. And it was a theme which came up during our co-sponsored meeting with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and UNESCO. And so much of our efforts in the working group and within ICOMOS for the last 3-4 years have been on addressing this challenge, have been on working with our membership to develop new ways to respond, to empower, to support, to validate, and to share knowledge and experience within our community, to give confidence, if you will, to the heritage sector to be able to respond to what is an incredibly urgent, but actually quite new challenge for many working within the heritage sector. And one of our flagship projects where we have been doing this is called the Preserving Legacies Project, and is a collaboration between ourselves at ICOMOS and the Climate Heritage Network, which Maro is also a part of. And it's been running since 2023. It's funded by the National Geographic, and the aim of the Preserving Legacies Project is to work directly with heritage professionals at sites and to help them prepare for and respond to both current but also future risks of climate change. And the aim of this is not to undertake risk assessments ourselves. Rather, it is to take people at all different places within the heritage sector around the world and to equip them with the climate knowledge, skills, and practical guidance to be able to become climate leaders within their own heritage sectors. So Preserving Legacies is really about the bottom-up transformation of the heritage sector. In 2024, we expanded working with 20 sites around the world. Our current cohort for 2025, the applications are open, and Mara will permit me to share a link to that at the end of my talk. We're very, very keen to expand this again, working with another 10 sites in 2025. I want to now share a short video, which I hope will work, because with presentations, sometimes they don't. Maro, if I could ask you just if this doesn't work, just to let me know and we'll just skip it. Okay.
Climate change doesn't just jeopardize our future, it threatens our past. As warming temperatures transform landscapes and intensify extreme weather, our places of cultural significance are at risk. If we don't act now, we could lose our histories, generational wisdom, and traditions, the anchors of culture-based economies, of local livelihoods, and the keys to our resilience as individuals and a species. That's where Preserving Legacies comes in. We're on a mission to empower every community with the scientific knowledge and technical training to protect their places of cultural significance from the impacts of climate change. Each year, Preserving Legacies selects a cohort of climate-impacted places from around the world to participate in our 3-phase program. In the first phase, custodians from each community, individuals that care for heritage places, complete 1 year of comprehensive climate training. Through online learning modules, discussion sessions, and in-person workshops, custodians strengthen their climate knowledge, capacity, and professional connections. In Phase 2, custodians apply that training to lead a climate risk assessment for their community. Risk assessments help communities map what they value most about their heritage, visualize current and projected climate hazards they might face, and evaluate which of their community's heritage values are most at risk to those climate hazards. In Phase 3, custodians use their risk assessment as a guide to design, implement, and test climate adaptation solutions. These climate solutions strengthen community resilience, break ground on adaptation efforts to protect sites, and mainstream culture and heritage into regional, national, and international climate policy. From the Ifugao rice terraces to the famous facades of Petra, Preserving Legacies is creating lasting impact for heritage protection and community well-being on every continent. Together, We are building a future for our past. Will you join us?
Great. So I'll share the link to that project and the 2025 application following my presentation. And one of the key things about preserving legacies is that it's open to all heritage sites. Our background is with culture, but we equally work with cultural landscapes, cultural natural sites, all forms of heritage from industrial through to archaeological are part of the project. But as ICOMOS, we also have a remit to work in the field of World Heritage. And we do this in conjunction with the other advisory bodies and the UNESCO World Heritage Centre. And one of the primary ways in which we're doing this at the moment is through the Climate Action Toolkit for World Heritage Project, which is a collaboration between all three advisory bodies and UNESCO. And this is seeking to create an official guidebook, an official toolkit specifically for World Heritage Site Managers, which aligns with the new policy document and will equip them and provide them with the skills to undertake their obligations under the convention while also preserving the outstanding universal value of their properties. One of the spin-offs of a number of these projects has been resources we've been developing specifically to raise climate literacy within the heritage sector. And this is beyond just our ICOMOS members. It extends into other heritage organizations, into funding bodies dealing with culture and heritage. Or in this case, this is from a month ago, where we ran this with the Office of Public Works in Dublin. And over the course of a full day, we go through the basics of climate science through into climate impacts. We spend a lot of time talking about full life cycle assessment and carbon mitigation in built heritage, especially for an audience like this. And then we also talk about how culture can be used as a positive force in broader climate action. And we're planning on extending this and expanding this massively in the coming years. We currently offer this in English and French, but our plan would be in the next few years to also offer it in as many other languages as possible, training trainers to actually deliver it around the world. We're also about to launch in the next couple of months a website which will contain a lot of these tools and resources. I won't say much more about that because I think we're kind of running out of time. But most of what I've talked about today are about bottom-up initiatives, about responding to calls from our membership for help in the area of climate action. But of course, ICOMOS also has a duty and a responsibility and a privilege of feeding into many of the higher level discussions, including the recent high-level ministerial event at the Conference of Parties in Baku, and also a statement at the G20 meeting in Brazil in 2024. And we're working towards engagement with other partners in the next COP, which will be in Belém in 2025. So thank you very much. I'm sorry if I've gone over, which I have, by about 5 minutes. My apologies. But thank you very much, and I look forward to our discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, William, for your presentation. So we could ask to the speakers some questions. If the participants want to share their questions through the chat, we are going to bring them to the speakers. Thank you, William, for sharing the link. So during the previous sessions, we asked the speakers about projects they were planning for 2025. Chris, could you tell us about any activity linking cultural heritage and climate action that you are planning perhaps for next year?
Yeah, great question, and really interesting. Thanks so much, William, for that great presentation. It's great to see that work going on, and it's interesting to think, the connection between, climate adaptation and climate impacts mitigation. And I think, like at least in the Canadian context, I think a lot of the emphasis thus far, given the kind of the responsibility from the global north in terms of us being the largest producers, the larger producers of carbon historically and in contemporary terms, a lot of the conversation has really been around mitigation to this point, and it's probably a important responsibility on our side. But of course, that whole kind of conversation around climate adaptation is also challenging. And I think, speaking of projects this year, Mauro, we've seen a lot of, well, maybe you've seen it in the news. It's gone around the world. Some of the largest wildfires last year happened in Canada. I think I thought I saw one stat that they burned 3 months worth of the U.S. oil consumption with those fires in terms of producing additional greenhouse gases, which is devastating. Anyway, so like those kind of situations in Canada in terms of getting ready for natural disasters, I think there's a task group and a work group that the National Trust is involved with, that's trying to put together toolkits for communities, more ground level communities, local communities, around how to respond in terms of some of the devastations around fires, in terms of extreme weather, in terms of flooding that we're seeing with increasing frequency here, at least in the Canadian context. So that's one. The other one is that we're looking probably at a federal election in Canada, probably early next year. And really wanting to put on the map this time in that election campaign, connecting the dots between between climate action and heritage reuse, heritage retention, and the sort of the intersections there. I think there's more work to be done in terms of establishing that intersection at the political level in decision makers' minds, elected officials' minds, and it's an opportunity for us to really work with partners like ICOMOS Canada and some of our other partners here, like CAP and Indigenous Heritage Circle, to really kind of elevate that conversation. So a couple of things around the adaptation side and around the mitigation side, I guess.
Thank you, Chris. William, do you want to ask the question to Chris? You chat.
Yeah, no, I would. And it's an honest question in that I teach so my non-ICOMOS job is I teach at Queen's University Belfast, and I teach in a school with planners, archaeologists, geographers, civil engineers, and architects. So in many ways, we are brilliantly suited to address some of these challenges. But there's a strong reticence amongst colleagues from a design perspective to switch the focus for undergraduate education, so young architects, from new design to retrofitting and reuse of buildings. And I'm wondering whether you talked about this a little bit in terms of maybe this being an absence, but I'm wondering whether you've had any experience in how we might go about doing this, because I think it's a really big challenge, right?
We wanted to dig in. Actually, we were just in Montreal at this conference just a month ago. Had a conversation with educators in the U.S. and Canada in terms of this problem, and I think really like Jorge Otero Payos from like Colombia came out with a really interesting article recently, and I encourage you to go check it out in Places magazine. It's called Retooling Architectural Education, Repairing Architectural Education. But it's really kind of going at that kind of like that elephant in the room in design education these days, where it's all about, it's still about creating new things. But I think that conversation is changing, and I think one of the things that we're going to be doing is really going to the architectural accreditation bodies here in Canada and having a conversation with them in terms of what they require of their students in terms of their accreditation, because I think that's where the rubber hits the road, and I think there's a significant, and finding those people who are working in this space in the architectural community, in the design community generally, who can help kind of make that case to those bodies. But I mean, it is a real challenge, and you can see it here. I mean, not just here in Ottawa at Carleton University, where there's a kind of a separation between the new design parts of the architecture school and the kind of the preservation, the conservation, engineering and conservation architecture spaces. There's a certain kind of a ranking, a kind of a hierarchy within it. But I think that's changing. And I think maybe that hierarchy is being maintained by the people teaching in the program rather than the young people coming into the programs, who I think basically they understand that reuse is the best pathway to an environmental future. I think that the structures themselves need retooling for sure.
Thank you. That's a really helpful answer. I think the idea of working with the accreditation bodies, because our programs in education are slaves to their accreditors, and that's a really powerful way. And I also agree that students being the change. I think we find our staff as being sometimes the more conservative ones, and like you say, students are asking for change. And yeah, so thank you. Really super answer. Thanks, Chris.
We have a question for William. How is the response from the communities? Where are you already working on the second phase of the Preserving Legacies projects?
Great question. But I'm going to do a political thing, and I'm going to say we're not working there, we're working with people there. So actually, we were just working in Cambodia, where our partners ran an entire climate risk assessment in Khmer in the local language. We'd been doing training with them for a year and a half, and they were the ones that ran it. Now, I don't speak Khmer. They might have been talking about the rugby for 2 days, for all I know. But I think that's part of our vision, because with previous projects in ICOMOS, which explored trialing and applying existing top-down techniques, they might have come up with a response, but they tended to sit on the shelf afterwards because they weren't embedded locally. And so the plan, generally speaking, there's a really positive response from local communities, because these are run by local communities as opposed to by us. In fact, generally speaking, we have very little to do with these workshops once we've done training and supported our team and provided the finance, which is a big factor too. So it doesn't always work perfectly, and it's tricky and difficult, but what I think we're working towards is, having every year having 10 more sites, 10 more communities with the knowledge to actually do this. So I hope that answers your question. But in a related question, Maro, and just to come back to your first question on what's for next year, our focus is on translation, is on taking resources we've developed and turning them into as many languages as possible. Because our space is still very Anglophone and to a lesser extent Francophone, as is much of the climate language that we use, and this can be a barrier to action. So we have another partner, Mahfouz Darain, who's Vice President of ICOMOS Bangladesh, who's currently translating all of our training resources into Bangla so that he can do it with his local communities. And that means we can then take those and share them out with other people too. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Yes, Chris.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw a question at William as well too, in terms of that you were just talking about top down and the bottom up sort of dimensions. I'm just wondering, like, in terms of, are there opportunities? I think there's always the challenge, within the kind of the conservation sphere, where we end up, at least at conferences, talking about some very kind of fancy buildings and the conservation solutions brought to them. often in places where money is no object. I'm wondering, like, if some of the things around the Preserving Legacies programs, like, is there an opportunity there to sort of, in your mind, to use some of those kind of iconic heritage, World Heritage sites as kind of poster children for a larger kind of conversation around and the knowledge transfer to some of the more local communities in terms of responses to, I guess, coastline erosion or other kind of extreme weather events, etc. I wonder if there's an opportunity to connect the dots between the bottom and the top, in a sense, with some of these initiatives. And I'm sure you're working on that already.
No, that's a great question. So yeah, the new UNESCO policy document, which we fed into, very much views World Heritage sites and iconic heritage sites as inspirational places, as promoting climate action in these places sends a message, essentially. And the focus there is as much on mitigation as it is on adaptation. There's an exact wordage, but I can't remember what it is. But the idea is that these iconic places have great power to inspire action. But as you say, that can sometimes separate them from the communities who live there. What we try and do in Preserving Legacies is, because we work with local partners, we do it based on community engagement and workshops. So last year we worked at Petra, which is hard to be more iconic than Petra. But we had a workshop with both heritage professionals and tourism people, but also local farmers who for the first time got to talk about the fact that, yes, there might be a risk to the temples, but actually it's getting very hot and very difficult to actually farm crops in the World Heritage Site. And people have been farming there for 3,000 years, right? So I think that does create a connection between top and bottom. And one of the big challenges in working outside of the global north, and these terms are never perfect, but is the kind of existing vulnerabilities in places that can impact on climate action. So I think we are very aware in Europe and North America the impacts of climate change. But in large parts of the world, there are other risks which communities are facing: conflict, poverty, livelihood loss, corruption, many other things as well, which also need to be part of the conversation in order for it to be relevant, right? And these things are kind of risk multipliers when it comes to climate change. And so I suppose it's about both. It's about using these iconic places, and we do work at very iconic places. So we were just in Angkor, we've been to Petra, but we also work with Aboriginal communities in Northern Australia, or Indigenous peoples in Luzon in the Philippines, or in the Pantanal in Brazil, in sites that aren't well known, right? And it's to use the iconic power of some heritage sites to elevate and lift others as well, I think, is what we're trying to do. Actually, we're working with the Rideau Canal as one of our sites in Canada, which you're probably within a couple of 100 yards of, I would think. So yeah.
I guess another question another thought I'd just like to throw out there, and it'd be interesting to hear what you think, and not to hijack the conversation here, but I think, like, when you were talking earlier about responses to climate change and adaptation, I think one of the really challenging conversations that's been happening in the conservation world, and people like Caitlin De Silva in UK, and Rodney Harrison and others like that have really brought it forward in terms of, when do you let go with heritage places, and to what degree, and to how do you respond? Is it always about adaptation with this idea of trying to endlessly kind of maintain these places? And I think we're seeing that here in the Canadian context, where there's some heritage sites up north which are being washed away. Herschel Island off the coast of Yukon, in the Arctic, in the Beaufort Sea, for instance, do you keep moving the buildings back, the historic structures and other materials back from the water's edge? Same with near the Hudson's Bay. There's this place called York Factory, like where the Hudson's Bay Company had its headquarters, and it's similarly distressed from river erosion. And I guess it leads to painful questions, and maybe that's part of the conversation that needs to happen also at the bottom level. A lot of these conversations in Canada are happening at the Parks Canada at the federal level, but I don't know whether that's that whole kind of idea of that kind of discussion around letting go. When does it make sense? Best practices around it. I don't know whether that's kind of become a part of that whole kind of preserving legacies conversation as well, and perhaps in what way.
Yeah, it has. We're having a great chat here. I hope other people don't mind. No, it's a key area, and in fact, a colleague of mine, Kathy Daly in Ireland, has talked about these tools as being a way to triage sites, because we're not going to be able to save everything. And in fact, we talk about it sometimes in the future tense, but as you say, this is a present decision making. And I think there's even harder decisions to be made when it comes to the resources involved sometimes in adapting incredibly iconic sites, and how those resources are then taken away from other sites. And some of the things that Rodney has written and on changing values surrounding heritage, that as our values change. We had some interesting discussions on loss and damage in this space in the heritage sector. And I think we're very well placed to lead in these discussions because loss in conservation has always formed a part of who we are and what we do. But for some of our communities we work with, climate change may be leading to loss, but that loss is an extension of a loss they've been feeling through historical and colonial processes for hundreds of years. Other cultures have a far more adaptive concept of values, where loss is a part of it. So if some of the Haida or Sangway in West Coast Canada, where actually loss is just a part of heritage. But I mean, I completely agree with you. I think climate change is and will increasingly force us to have to confront these tricky questions of loss and what we are losing. And I think where we need to be slightly careful is the current UNFCCC Western approach to this is monetary value, when actually for much heritage there is no monetary value. The loss is invaluable, and it's quite insulting to suggest that. And so it's a very tricky space, tricky space to work in. And I mean, I think to maybe give an example of conversations we have had, what's more important at a World Heritage Site, the loss of OUV or the loss of other values which communities rely on in a changing climate? And that's a difficult decision that sites are having to make, because the emphasis is always on the preservation of outstanding universal value, but OUV is just one value in many others. And often it is other values that can be at greater risk. And those values, do we preserve buildings at the extent of the people who live in them, for example? And with changing climates, that's becoming an even more pressing question. And I think also with values, I mean, one of the things I'm interested in, and I don't have any answer to this, but I took my children to a folk park recently, and they smelled for the first time the smell of peat being burned. So we burn peat in Ireland, and they'd never smelled coal being burnt, right? And it led me to think about, we have such rich industrial heritages, but how are those heritages going to be understood by future generations in light of the climate change? Will they attain negative value? And how are we going to, as heritage professionals, start addressing that, where we can accept the wonderful values associated with these places, while also having an honest conversation about negative values? And yeah, sorry, that's a very rambling answer to that, but it's such an interesting question, Chris. I'll actually be in Ottawa in a few weeks, so maybe we can meet up and have a coffee.
Oh, for sure. Connect. Please connect.
Yeah, we'll do. Absolutely. Sorry, Mauro, we've dominated this conversation.
Thank you for both of you for the conversation. Do we have any additional questions for the speakers? So we are inviting you to share a final comment for this roundtable, please.
Oh, great.
Chris, William?
I'm not sure I was prepared for a final comment. I've talked a lot about adaptation, risk and adaptation, and I think that is right. Working within the heritage sector, we're responding to the challenges we see on the ground. But I think we often forget that the only real way to save as much heritage as possible is actually within the area where Chris is working, which is mitigation. That we're never going to be able to save enough sites. We're never going to be able to build a wall that's tall enough. And I truly believe that one of the great things heritage has to offer people is a person-centered lens through which people can understand climate change in a very human and very real way. And I think that needs to be one of our duties as heritage people, to have these conversations and to use these special places to address this. And I'd really encourage everybody to think about what's the climate stories in their places and how can we use these places to emphasize that need for climate action. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, William. Chris?
Yeah, I think that's just building on that. I think that's really fascinating in terms of rooting it in people's not sort of not identifying heritage as something happens elsewhere that happened that other people are involved with. That it's around you in your local communities and rooting it there, and really sort of showing people that there are opportunities to make a difference in terms of their own decision making, in terms of the heritage that is all around them, in terms of maximizing that the longevity of it, recognizing the value of it, and taking it to taking it further. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to move beyond the theoretical, move beyond some of these conversations, which are great within our own kind of communities, but really to sort of push it out into the marketplace and start thinking about how to transform that mainstream kind of conversation. Because I think we were saying before, I think there's a new generation that understands the connections between all of these challenges, and consumption of resources beyond what the planet can sustain, and I think there's new rising generations get it, and we can connect with them further. So that's exciting for all of us.
Thank you, Chris. Well, we are arriving to the end of this roundtable, so we want to thank Chris Wiebe and William Megarry for participating in this session at the International Congress of Culture in Climate Action.
Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Nice. Thank you very much. I don't know. Have a lovely weekend, everyone. Bye.